So it's a pleasure and honor to introduce two friends and colleagues, Professor Daniel, who are going to be debating. This is going to be Israeli style, we hope. So no holds barred. So Professor Daniel Filc is from the Department of Politics and Government at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He is originally an MD, but he moved to the, don't want to say dark side, but to the right side. And among his field of research are Israeli politics, populism, and the healthcare system. He has written extensively on public-private interface in the healthcare system and on its consequences for inequity, and also on healthcare policy of vulnerable population. And among his books is the Circles of Exclusion, The Politics of Healthcare in Israel, and the Political Right in Israel, The Many Faces of Israeli Populism and Its Politics, which unfortunately is now going to be specifically topical. I will move on to introduce Professor Varda Shalev, who is a real innovator and entrepreneur in the field of digital health. She's an MD, MPH, also a graduate of Ben-Gurion University. Importantly, she was founder and CEO of the Maccabi Research and Innovation Institute. And this actually came after she did a postdoc in medical informatics, I think when most of us didn't know computers exist. So she was really a very early developer of digital health, and today she serves as a management partner of a company called Team 8. So we are looking forward to a lively discussion on big data. And before I sit with you, I want to give a little bit of a context for the first question. So in Israel, as in many European countries, we have a public health system. So essentially, our entire system is largely paid for by our taxes. We each pay a health tax. Every person pays a health tax that's commensurate with their income, and all the citizens are insured. And the way that care is delivered is once you pay the health tax, the government distributes the funds to one of 4 HMOs, or we call them sick funds. And essentially, they are the ones that deliver care. The system was set up to encourage competition within the system. So it's a single payer in the sense that all the money flows from the government, but the payer and the provider are not the same. The payer is the government and the providers are the HMOs. And in addition to this, people often pay additional supplementary insurance. About 80% of Israelis pay out-of-pocket supplementary insurance in addition to these HMOs. So, you know, I said earlier that Professor Shalev was the founder and CEO of the Maccabi Research Institute, which was built on the big data of Maccabi healthcare. Essentially, Israeli healthcare has been digitized for at least 20 years now. So there is a wealth of, a breadth of data and a lot of longitudinal data as well. So the first question I'm going to pose to both of you is, in a publicly funded health system, who owns the health data and who's allowed to use it and for what purposes?
Okay. So there are a few owners. It's not one owner. I believe that the patient has to be one of the owners. Of course, he has to have access to the data. He has to have the data, not only access to the data. For example, in the US, there is a law, the 21st Century Cure Act, that was founded a year and a half ago on April last year, and says that every provider should provide the data in a certain format to the patient, because there are many applications around the globe for Parkinson, for Crohn's, for controlling diabetes, and you want them to be able to use this application, and you can do it only by letting them having this data and using it. Fortunately enough, I was part of the Israeli government committee for data lately, and I told them, you know, if we won't do it, we won't be able to bypass the ownership of the HMOs and the hospitals and the organizations. We should allow the patient get his data. That's one issue. And if you want to be part of clinical trial, to use an application, whatever, you can do it with your own data. That's one issue. The other issue is, and I can tell you, I got back to Maccabi in 2000 from Johns Hopkins, where I did my postdoc in medical informatics, and you're right, everybody was telling me, what is it, medical informatics? But I had the feeling that we won't be able to scale up on medicine if we won't have computers in our domain, because everything is within the room, you don't know what's going on there. If you know, it's very late. To extract the data, it's very difficult. And I came to Maccabi, started actually to arrange the data. And the data was very like a mess, okay? So the same diagnosis could have 3 codes, in 4 digits, in 5 digits, in 9 digits. Everything was mixed. And I said, okay, do you want me to arrange it? I take the key and I arrange it myself, okay? Nobody can add any code or delete any code, and I did it. With the time, we had to invest a lot of money in doing it. And nobody in the organization was willing to invest this money. And I'm answering you. And I said, you know, it's very important, this building block. We have to do it. So if we invested in the data, we should get something out of this investment, so we will be willing to invest in the future as well. And here starts the problem, because the HMO says, it's my data. I don't want to share it. I invested in it. So here it's a matter of how much, and do you share it, and what, for which purposes, and do you charge the same amount of money a researcher or a company? So there are many questions. But I always tell people who says, we are sitting on oil. Data is like the new oil. If you sit on this oil field and you don't use it, you have nothing. So we have to share, but we have to get something out of it, so you will have the incentive to develop more and more data. And thirdly, the physician. So if the patient is the owner, can he delete the data from my electronic patient record? No. I treated him. I want to have access to the data, to see what I've done, to do research on this data. So it's also the physicians, the organizations, and the patient. And of course, the government also has to have access. And by the way, Dina, when I was the head of medical informatics, they were always, every year, I was getting a call from my CEO that in the Varda Sal, in the basket committee, they said that Varda Shalev is providing data to the pharma companies. And I said, yes, I want them to make decisions based on data. It's anonymized data, but I want them to know the data, to know. And there is still a debate whether we should provide data to the basket, also to the organization. And I'll tell you, the HMOs, they don't want to share this data because then they have the advantage of having the data and nobody else is having this data, even the basket, okay? So those are part of the issues that I can say.
Okay. I think that we should treat that kind of data as the commons, as a common property of those who provide the data and also finance. Because when you say, Varda, that the HMOs say, okay, we paid for that, so we own it, the HMOs didn't pay for that. We, as citizens, paid for that because that came from our taxes. Because in Israel, the HMOs are funded 90% at least by monies coming from the health tax or from the general budget.
Just one comment to explain myself. To explain myself. The government pays, but one HMO does something with the data, and the other HMO doesn't. So you need an incentive, you know?
Okay, or regulation, or legislation. It depends. But if we treat that as the commons, then the ownership is collective. It's problematic to say that there is a level of individual ownership, both because, and there is a lot of literature about ownership on big data and on health big data, because it's difficult to define what should be counted as health data. It's difficult, and because data is renewable, and the problem is that you must, it can get old very quickly, but it can be used by different users without, it's reusable. So it's very different from property of, I don't know, of cars or clothes. So the idea of the commons, the idea of collective property, is much more suited for the needs of the healthcare system, for the needs of citizens. Now, if you treat the health data as commons, then you have to face some questions about, for example, the problem of appropriation, whether there is enclosure of the data by, for example, a physician or a specific HMO. You need to provide citizens the way to be much more involved in the HMO's decisions about who are using the data. You need to define different ethical levels of use of the data. It's not the same that if the data will be used by public researchers, by private medical drug companies, or by commercial companies that are interested in the data, for example, to improve the private insurance. So those are questions that should be decided not by the individual physician, nor by the managers of a specific HMO, but by a democratic body which represents the different stakeholders. When you think about data as commons, then you think about stakeholders, and we should design institutions that would allow the different stakeholders to have a say in the decision about how the data as commons are used.
I want to take this one step further and say, assuming that the public, certainly in a public health system, has rights that we can, obviously you've heard the distinctions here, but assuming that such rights exist, what would you consider as adequate or appropriate returns to society for offering this data? So I'm now moving a little bit away from ownership and trying to say, what do you view as appropriate or adequate rewards?
Okay, so I can say, first, we have to be fast. You know, all the organization, they take everything, we won't do anything. You know, I'm in innovation many years. When we started the electronic patient record, everybody told me the physician won't work with computers. They won't do it. They won't, you don't have a chance. You have to start. And if you wait to all this committee, you'll never do anything. And by the way, if within the organization, they won't be able to compete, and I wanted to compete, and that's why we were so successful. So that's why, just in brackets. You know, we have built a biobank within Maccabi, and Efrat was part of the committee in the biobank. And you know, when you say, what can we give the patients, there was a debate here whether when you build a biobank, and most of the biobanks are anonymized completely. So you say, I take your blood, I take your data, and I make my research. But whenever I take the blood, I connect it with the data, I do an anonymization, and that's it. There is a wall between the two. And I said to myself, how can I sleep at night within an HMO, knowing that I have a patient, 20 years old, with long QT, or BRCA, or familial polyposis? I can't. So even though we are working on anonymized data, we have to get back to the patient with actionable items. So what we gave back the society, we got back to the patients and told the informed consent was set in such a way. We took first a large committee with a lot of geneticists and a lot of people within stakeholders that understood from different areas, and we decided that on actionable items, we always get back to the patient. So if we found a long QT in research, or one of the 57, I think, mutations that are actionable, we went back, what?
The number keeps changing, but that doesn't...
Okay, it changes all the time, and that's how the informed consent was set. Second thing, we developed a lot of algorithms based on the data, which is predictive and prescriptive, as was said here today. For example, for diagnosis of colon cancer based on CBC, age and gender. And we returned it to the organization, and all the patients could have passive screening based on their CBC. And we found more than 100 patients with colon cancer and a lot more with polyps. So actually you need to get back to the patient.
I want to make life harder for you. So getting back to the patient, you know, is a whole concern, but presumably, like you said, you provide data to pharma companies and to you know, med tech, and obviously the organization gets remunerated for, you know, for giving the data. So is it sufficient that Maccabi lines its coffers, or, you know, should society, should somebody else be getting reaping these financial benefits? That's the more what I was aiming at.
So,
yes, you spoke about speed of innovation and competition. I would say that I want good science and good democracy. And good science and good democracy require patience, not only speed. Speed is only part. You yourself told about your mistake that because of doing things very quickly.
I know slow mistakes a lot.
Every time I will...
No, but I know slow mistakes too.
Every time I will talk, you will interrupt me?
Always. She told me.
No.
That was my mission for it.
Yes, you're very quick in interrupting me.
I know, I told you.
Okay, so I think that democracy and ethics take time. It's not only about doing things quick, it's about doing things right. And doing things right requires regulation, and regulation requires time. And I think it's always very easy to give us an example of the individual patient that will die if we don't do things quickly. But we don't, as a society, we don't have only responsibility for that individual patient, but we have responsibility for all potential patients and for the damages that doing things very quickly could have to other patients. So, and concerning the question, I think that if we are speaking about non-profit public HMOs, in my view, the revenues that the HMOs get are revenues for the public. If there are enough regulations that do two things. One, do not allow the Ministry of Finance to take from the HMOs the money that enters them, so to balance the budget. That's one point. And the second point, if there is some kind of mechanism for equalizing between the different HMOs so as not to benefit only those members of a specific HMO at the cost of the other. But it's very different. How do we cope with the benefits that private companies will have from that? And then taxation should be the answer.
So in HMOs, research is not important to most of the people in HMOs. Professor Berliner is here, and he knows our organization pretty well. I'm not there anymore, but it was mine back then. And it's not important to most of the people. They have to provide medicines and, you know, hospitals and things like that. If you want people to do innovation, they have to have an incentive. They say, okay, I will do this biobank. I'll clean the database. I'll do research, and I'll get some return on the investment in money-wise. So I'll be able to invest more and build a biobank, and invest more and build algorithms. And if you say, it's, you know, in Israel we had kibbutz. Kibbutz, you know what a kibbutz is? It's like a small village. And they created it when Israel was founded, you know, back then. And they said, everybody gives what he can and takes what he needs. Great. There is no one kibbutz today that exists in this matter because people stopped working. And it's the same way with HMOs. If you want people to sleep and to say, I don't care, I won't do innovation. In any ways, if I'll get something out of it, I'll give it to another HMO. So they won't do it. So we need some competition. It should be balanced. It should have weights. And of course, talking about slow and fast, also there are, you know, weights. It's not a plus and minus. But I just tell you, the world is moving fast. We want to bring our patients innovation. When Dina sits in the BASC committee, she has how many innovations this year? And you have to hear to
1,000 pages of
1,000 pages. And she can say, I want to do it properly. So I will take any innovation and read it for a week. A week is not too much for one innovation. But they will get it in 4 years. So you have to be fast. This world is fast. I'm very happy that we have ethics. And by the way, in my committee, in the biobank, for example, I have an ethics committee. And I told you, I had so many people that could shed light on holes that I wouldn't be able to see. But you need competition. Otherwise, we won't be able to have research and data.
You know, Varda, it's very easy to use the kibbutz as a way to dismiss any attempt to control capitalism. But I can say that if you know, tobacco companies and soft drink companies, they're all about innovation and competition, and the health results of those unregulated competition are far worse than the problem of some kibbutz members not working because they are not rewarded. So I think that using competition as a kind of buzzword to justify everything, it's problematic. I would think, and you say, okay, there is somebody investing, perfectly. He or she or they should be rewarded for their investment, but this reward should be done considering all the public resources that those private investors are using. They are using public data because the data belong to the citizens. They are using physicians who were educated, paying much less than the real cost of their education with public monies. They were trained into research by public hospitals and public HMOs. So if we have to really take into account incentives, the incentives should also take into account the way in which private companies are parasite on public monies and or public funds.
Yes, so it should get back.
We want to get some questions from the audience, please.
Yes.
No.
אני נותנת להם כבר רשות, אתה מבינה?
Hi. Thank you for a very interesting debate. I did want to ask, specifically for Maccabi, they are more prominent in urban places.
In what?
In cities, rather than in the periphery of Israel. So that also causes some kind of bias when you use the data forward. Is this something that is considered when
Of
you
course.
forward the data and then when you return to the patients? Also, when all the patients that potentially could be in Maccabi that aren't, like, how does this relay forward?
You know, on every bias that you'll provide me, I'll provide you 10. And we'll play the game and I'll win. Because, because there are so many biases in data. And if you remember my comment to Michal, biases is the main problem in data, okay? So it's not only we have less Arabs in Maccabi than in other HMOs. Back then we were younger and now we are older than the others. We have independent physicians mostly and not salaried physicians. So there are many, many biases. And that's why I think that you should know very well the data and the origin of the data in order to control those biases. And I'll tell you, when we talk about registries, it depends when you decide to start the research. For example, Michal said, I'm doing a research about Parkinson's. So I started all the registries in Maccabi. So how do you build a registry? You put inclusion and exclusion criteria, okay? And you say this patient is eligible for the name diabetic. This patient has hypertension, okay? But it depends how you do it. So for example, the Parkinson registry that we have built, and we have done it in a way that we said, you know, there are not biomarkers. So you don't have blood test or something. So it's only clinical diagnosis. We said, okay, you need one diagnosis from a neurologist or two diagnoses from different two physicians in order to be eligible to be, and of course, if you have medicines for Parkinson, you need a diagnosis and a medicine. That's roughly. I won't go into details. When I went to do a research on Parkinson, I took a good friend of mine who is the head of Parkinson in Ichilov, and I told him, let's go over the patient's files and see. And we saw that only 60% of them, in his eyes, had Parkinson, okay? So when you start the research and you say, those have Parkinson, who knows? You don't know the data. And many times, that's the problem. I see it when, you know, when you make mistakes on the origin of the tree, you have problems with the leaves and the flowers and everything.
Any more questions? We have a couple of minutes for some more questions. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that being in the health basket, the health basket is a committee that every year gets around $500,000 milliard shekels for entering new technologies and drugs into the health basket for the people of Israel. And I'm very much concerned about the connection between drug companies and patients' data. And you're saying that it's anonymous, but it's never anonymous. And I think that drug companies are making use of it to get a lot of money. And I'm very much concerned about it.
Okay.
Oh, I only agree.
So I don't.
I think that there
If
is...
you agree, Varda will not, and we'll have
No
a very
problem,
good
yes.
answer.
Right.
No, it's true. Once again, there is a place for private drug companies, but the dimension of their earnings and the ways in which I remember that when there was a public discussion about introducing what they were called life-saving cancer drugs, which in fact, in average, prolonged life in a couple of months, whether they should be included in the private insurance schemes promoted by the HMOs, And there was a discussion because that would mean that the public pressure to introduce those drugs into the public system would diminish. The drug companies paid patients to come to the Knesset committee which discussed the issue to give private personal testimonies. Now, it's very difficult for a member of the Knesset to cope with a cancer patient who is, but that was paid without the members of the Knesset knowing that was paid by the drug companies because they were interested in the earnings and in the profits by introducing that, and they weren't not interested in the influence on equity of access and in health disparities. So for me, you can't do without them, but you should be very, very, very careful when dealing with drug companies.
I think that dealing with patients' data, you should be cautious all the time. And you know, as a physician, and this morning at 6 a.m., I've done my clinic. I see patients every week, twice a week. So I'm not far from the patients. And I feel that I owe them a lot of privacy and security. And I feel it every day on the field. On the other hand, when I treat patients, I listen to them. I take anamnesis. I examine them. I do diagnosis, and then I have to give them usually a medicine. And I want to talk to the very cautiously, never to provide them with a data that is identified. And about, anonymized data, we can talk hours. It's a new session, so I won't get into it. But of course, we should be cautious, but we should talk. It's like even if with our enemies, we say here in Israel, we have to talk. Because if you don't talk, you don't know the other side. And we have to talk, and we have to bring them to those conferences of ethics, to let them listen what we think from both sides. But we can't ignore them. It's a big player in our market. And they should make decisions based on real data. And we should know that we provide them data that they should make better decisions upon this data. That's what I think.
So I want to thank Varda and Daniel. I think you delivered. And of course to our speakers, Sandra and Michal, for excellent talks. And we will meet again after lunch.
Thank you.